Chapter 5. I should have lived happy enough in that country if my littleness had not exposed me to several ridiculous and troublesome accidents, some of which I shall venture to relate. Glumdalclitch often carried me in the gardens of the court in my smaller box, and would sometimes take me out of it and hold me in her hand, or set me down to walk. I remember, before the dwarf left the queen, he followed us one day into those gardens, and my nurse having set me down, he and I being close together near some dwarf apple trees, I must needs show my wit by a silly allusion between him and the trees, which happens to hold in their language as it doth in ours. Whereupon the malicious rogue, watching his opportunity when I was walking under one of them, shook it directly over my head, by which a dozen apples, each of them as near large as a Bristol barrel, came tumbling about my ears. One of them hit me on the back as I chanced to stoop, and knocked me down flat on my face. But I received no other hurt, and the dwarf was pardoned at my desire, because I had given the provocation. Another day, Glumdalclitch left me on the smooth grass plot to divert myself while she walked at some distance with her governess. In the meantime, there suddenly fell such a violent shower of hail that I was immediately, by the force of it, struck to the ground. And when I was down, the hailstones gave me such cruel bangs all over the body as if I had been pelted with tennis balls. However, I made a shift to creep on all four, and shelter myself by lying on my face in the lee side of a border of lemon thyme, but so bruised from head to foot that I could not go abroad in 10 days. Neither is this at all to be wondered at, because nature in that country observing the same proportion through all her operations, a hailstone is near 1800 times as large as one in Europe, which I can assist upon experience, having been so curious to weigh and measure them. But a more dangerous accident happened to me in the same garden, when my little nurse, believing she had put me in a secure place, which I often entreated her to do so, that I might enjoy my own thoughts, and having left my box at home to avoid the trouble of carrying it, went to another part of the garden with her governess, and some ladies of her acquaintance. While she was absent and out of hearing, a small white spaniel, belonging to one of the chief gardeners, having got by accident into the garden, happened to range near the place where I lay. The dog, following the scent, came directly up, and taking me in his mouth, ran straight to his master, wagging his tail, and set me gently on the ground. By good fortune, that had been so well taught that I was carried between the teeth without the least hurt, or even tearing my clothes. But the poor gardener, who knew me well, and had a great kindness for me, was in a terrible fright. He gently took me up in both his hands and asked me how I did, but I was so amazed and out of breath that I could not speak a word. In a few minutes I came to myself, and he carried me safe to my little nurse, who by this time had returned to the place where she had left me, and was in cruel agonies when I did not appear, nor answer when she called. She severely reprimanded the gardener on account of his dog. But the thing was hushed up and never known at court, for the girl was afraid of the queen's anger, and truly, as to myself, I thought it would not be for my reputation that such a story should go about. This accident absolutely determined Glumdalclitch never to trust me abroad for the future out of her sight. I had been long afraid of this resolution, and therefore concealed from her some little unlucky adventures that happened in those times when I was left by myself. Once a kite hovering over the garden made a swoop at me, and if I had not resolutely drawn my hanger and run under a thick espalier, he would have certainly carried me away in his talons. Another time, walking to the top of a fresh molehill, I felt my neck in the hole, through which the animal had cast up the earth, and coined some lie, not worth remembering, to excuse myself for spoiling my clothes. I likewise broke my right shin against the shell of a snail, which I happened to stumble over, as I was walking alone and thinking on poor England. I could not tell whether I was more pleased or mortified to observe in these solitary walks that the smaller birds did not appear to be at all afraid of me, but would hop about within a yard distance, looking for worms and other food with as much indifference and security as if no creature were there near them. I remember a thrush had the confidence to snatch out of my hand with his bill a piece of cake that Glumdalclitch had given me for my breakfast. When I attempted to catch any of these birds, they would boldly turn against me, endeavoring to pick my fingers, which I durst not venture within their reach, and then they would hop hop back unconcerned to hunt for worms or snails, as they did before. But one day I took a thick cudgel and threw it with all my strength, so luckily it had in it that I knocked him down, and seizing him by the neck with both my hands, ran with him in triumph to my nurse. However, the bird, who had only been stunned, recovering himself, gave me so many boxes with his wings on both sides of my head and body, though I held him at arm's length and was out of the reach of his claws, that I was 20 times thinking to let him go. But I was soon relieved by one of our servants, who wrung off the bird's neck, and I had him next day for dinner, by the Queen's command. This linnet, as near as I can remember, seemed to be somewhat larger than an English swan. The maids of honor often invited Glumdalclitch to their apartments, and desired she would bring me along with her, on purpose to have the pleasure of seeing and touching me. They would often lay me at full length in their bosoms, wherewith I was much disgusted, because, to say the truth, a very offensive smell came from their skins, which I did not mention or intend to the disadvantage of those excellent ladies, for whom I have all manner of respect. But I conceived that my sense was more acute in proportion to my littleness, and that those illustrious persons were no more disagreeable for their lovers, or to each other, than people of the same quality are with us in England. And after that, I found their natural smell was much more supportable than when they used perfumes, under which I immediately swooned away. I cannot forget that an intimate friend of mine in Lilliput took the freedom in a warm day, when I had used a good deal of exercise, to complain of a strong smell about me, although I am as little faulty that way as most of my sex. But I suppose his faculty of smelling was as nice with regard to me as mine was that of these people. Upon this point I cannot forbear doing justice to the Queen my mistress, and Glumdalclitch my nurse, whose persons are as sweet as those of any lady in England. That which gave me most uneasiness among the maids of honor, when my nurse carried me to visit them, was to see them use me without any manner of ceremony, like a creature who had no sort of consequence, for they would strip themselves to the skin, and put on their smocks in my presence, while I was placed on their toilet table directly before their naked bodies, which, I am sure, to me was very far from being a tempting sight, or from giving me any other emotions than those of horror and disgust. Their skins appeared so coarse and uneven, so variously colored when I saw them near, with a mole here and there as broad as a trencher, and hairs hanging from it thicker than pack-threads, to say nothing further concerning the rest of their persons. One day a young gentleman, who was nephew to my nurse's governess, came and pressed them both to see an execution. It was of a man who had murdered one of the gentleman's intimate acquaintance. Glumdalclitch was prevailed on to be of the company, very much against her inclination, for she was naturally tender-hearted, and for myself, although I abhorred such kind of spectacles, yet my curiosity tempted me to see something that I thought might be extraordinary. The malefactor was fixed in a chair, upon a scaffold erected for that purpose, and his head cut off at a blow with a sword of about 40 feet long. The veins and arteries spouted up such a prodigious quantity of blood, and so high in the air, that the great jet d'eau at Vessel was not equal for the time it lasted, and the head, when it fell off the scaffold floor, gave such a bounce as made me start, although I were at least half an English mile distant. The Queen, who often used to hear me talk of my sea voyages, and took all occasions to divert me when I was melancholy, asked me whether I understood how to handle a sail or an oar, and whether a little exercise of rowing might not be convenient for my health. I answered that I understood both very well, for although my proper employment had been to be a surgeon or doctor to the ship, yet often, upon a pinch, I was forced to work like a common mariner. But I could not see how this could be done in their country, where the smallest wherry was equal to a first-rate man of war among us, and such a boat as I could manage would never live in any of their rivers. Her Majesty said if I would contrive a boat, her own jointer should make it, and she would provide a place for me to sail in. The fellow was an ingenious workman, and by my instructions, in 10 days finished a pleasure boat with all its tacking, able to conveniently to hold 8 Europeans. When it was finished, the Queen was so delighted that she ran with it in her lap to the King, who ordered it to be put in a cistern full of water, with me in it by way of trial. where I could not manage my two sculls or little oars for want of room. But the queen had before contrived another project. She ordered the joiner to make a wooden trough of 300 feet long, 50 broad, and 80 deep, which, being well pitched to prevent leaking, was placed on the floor along the wall, in an outer room of the palace. It had a cock near the bottom to let out the water when it began to grow stale, and 2 servants could easily fill it in half an hour. Here I often used to row for my own diversion, as well as that of the queen and her ladies, who thought themselves well entertained with my skill and agility. Sometimes I would put up my sail, and then my business was only to steer, while the ladies gave me a gale with their fans, and when they were weary, some of the pages would blow my sail forward with their breath, while I showed my art by steering starboard or larboard, as I pleased. When I had done, Glumdalclitch always carried my boat into her closet and hung it on a nail to dry. In this exercise I once met an accident which had like to have cost me my life, for one of the pages having put my boat into the trough, and the governess who attended Glumdalclitch very officiously lifted me up to place me in the boat, but I happened to slip through her fingers, and should have infallibly fallen down 40 feet upon the floor, if, by the luckiest chance in the world, I had not been stopped by a corking pin that stuck in the good gentlewoman's stomacher. The head of the pin passed between my shirt and waistband of my breeches, and thus I was held in the middle, but in the air until Glumdalclitch ran to my relief. Another time, one of the servants, whose office it was to fill my trough every 3rd day with fresh water, was so careless to let a huge frog, not perceiving it, slip out of his pail. The frog lay concealed till I was put into my boat, and then seeing a resting place, climbed up and made it lean so much on one side that I was forced to balance with all my weight on the other, to prevent overturning. When the frog was got in, it hopped once half the length of the boat, and then over my head, backwards and forwards, daubing my face and clothes with its odious slime. The largeness of its features made it appear the most deformed animal that could be conceived. However, I desired Glumdalclitch to let me deal with it alone. I banged it a good while with one of my sculls, and at last forced it to leap out of the boat. But the greatest danger I ever underwent in that kingdom was from a monkey, who belonged to one of the clerks at the kitchen. Glumdalclitch had locked me up in her closet while she went somewhere upon business or a visit. The weather being warm, the closet window was left open, as well as the windows in the door of my bigger box, in which I usually lived, because of its largeness and conveniency. As I sat quietly meditating at my table, I heard something bounce in at the closet window, and skip about from one side to the other, whereat, although I was much alarmed, yet I ventured to look out, but stirred not from my seat, and then I saw the frolicsome animal frisking and leaping up and down, till at last he came to my box, which he seemed to view with great pleasure and curiosity, peeping in at the door and every window. I retreated to the further corner of my room, or box, but the monkey, looking in at every side, put me into such a fright that I wanted presence of mind to conceal myself under the bed, as I might easily have done after some time spent in peeping, grinning, and chattering. He at last espied me, and reached one of his paws in at the door, as a cat does when she plays with a mouse. Although I often shifted place to avoid him, or he at length seized the lappet of my coat, which being made in that country cloth was very thick and strong, and dragged me out. He took me up in his right forefoot, held me as a nurse does a child she is going to suckle, just as I have seen the same sort of creature do with a kitten in Europe, and when I offered to struggle, he squeezed me so hard that I thought it more prudent to submit. I have good reason to believe he took me for a young one of his own, by his often stroking my face very gently with his other paw. In these diversions he was interrupted by a noise at the closet door, as if somebody were opening it, whereupon he suddenly leapt up to the window at which he had come in, and thence upon the leads and gutters, walking upon 3 legs, and holding me in the 4th, till he climbed up to a roof that was next to ours. I heard Glumdalclitch give a shriek at the moment he was carrying me out. The poor girl was almost distracted. That a quarter of the palace was all in an uproar. The servants ran for ladders. The monkey was seen by hundreds in the court, sitting upon the ridge of a building, holding me like a baby in one of its 4 paws, and feeding me with the other, by cramming into my mouth some victuals he had squeezed out of the bag on one side of his chaps, and patting me when I would not eat, whereat many of the rabble below could not forbear laughing. Neither do I think they justly ought to be blamed, for without question the sight was ridiculous enough to everybody but myself. Some of the people threw up stones, hoping to drive the monkey down, but this was strictly forbidden, or else very probably my brains had been dashed out. The ladders were now applied and mounted by several men, with which the monkey observing, and finding himself almost encompassed, not being able to make speed enough with his 3 legs, let me drop on a ridge tile and made his escape. Here I sat for some time 300 yards from the ground, expecting every moment to be blown down by the wind, or to fall by my own giddiness, and come tumbling over and over from the ridge to the eaves. But an honest lad, one of my nurse's footmen, climbed up and, putting me into his breeches pocket, brought me down safe. I was almost choked with the filthy stuff the monkey had crammed down my throat, but my dear little nurse picked it out of my mouth with a small needle, and when I fell vomiting, which gave me great relief. Yet I was so weak and bruised in the sides with the squeezes given by this odious animal, I was forced to keep my bed a fortnight. The king, queen, and all the court sent every day to inquire after my health, and her majesty made me several visits during my sickness. The monkey was killed, and an order made that no such animal should be kept about the palace. When I attended the king after my recovery, to return him thanks for his favors, he was pleased to rally me a good deal upon this adventure. He asked me what my thoughts and speculations were while I lay in the monkey's paw, how I liked the victuals he gave me, his manner of feeding, and whether the fresh air on the roof had sharpened my stomach. He desired to know what I would have done upon such an occasion in my own country. I told his majesty that in Europe we had no monkeys, except such as were brought for curiosities from other places, so small that I could deal with a dozen of them together, if they presumed to attack me. And as for the monstrous animal with whom I was so lately engaged, it is indeed as large as an elephant. If my fears had suffered me to think so far as to make use of my hanger, looking fiercely and clapping my hand upon the hilt as I spoke, when he poked his paw into my chamber, perhaps I should have given him such a wound as would have made him glad to withdraw it, with more haste than he put it in. This I delivered in a firm tone, like a person who was jealous lest his courage should be called into question. However, my speech produced nothing else besides a loud laughter, which all the respect due to his majesty from those about him could not make them contain. This made me reflect how vain an attempt it is for a man to endeavor doing himself honor among those who are out of all degree of equality or comparison with him. Yet I have seen the moral of my own behavior very frequent in England since my return, where a little contemptible valet, without the least title to birth, person, wit, or common sense, shall presume to look with importance and put himself upon a foot with the greatest persons of the kingdom. I was every day furnishing the court with some ridiculous story, and Glumdalclitch, although she loved me to excess, yet was arch enough to inform the queen, whenever I commented any folly that she thought would be diverting to her majesty. The girl, who had been out of order, was carried by her governess to take the air of about an hour's distance, or 30 miles from the town. They alighted out of the coach near a small footpath in the field, and Glumdalclitch setting down my travelling box, I went out of it to walk. There was a cow dung in the patch, and I must needs try my activity by attempting to leap over it. I took a run, but unfortunately jumped short, and found myself just up in the middle to my knees. I waded through with some difficulty, and one of the footmen wiped me clean, as he could, with his handkerchief, for I was filthy bemired, and my nurse confined me to my box till I returned home, where the queen was soon informed of what had passed, and the footmen spread it about the court, so that all the mirth for some days was at my expense. Chapter 6. I used to attend the king's levee once or twice a week, and had often seen him under the barber's hand, which indeed was at first very terrible to behold, for the razor was almost twice as long as an ordinary scythe. His majesty, according to the custom of the country, was only shaved twice a week. I once prevailed on the barber to give me some of the studs or lather, out of which I picked 40 or 50 of the strongest stumps of hair. I then took a fine piece of wood and cut it like the back of a comb, making several holes in it at equal distance, with as small a needle as I could get from Glumdalclitch. I fixed in the stumps so artificially, scraping and slopping them with my knife towards the points, and I made a very tolerable comb, which was a seasonable supply, my own being so much broken in the teeth that it was almost useless. Neither did I know any artist in the country so nice and exact as would undertake to make me another. And this puts me in mind of an amusement wherein I spent many of my leisure hours. I desired the Queen's woman to save for me the combings of Her Majesty's hair, whereof in time I got a good quantity, and consulting with my friend, their cabinet maker, who had received general orders to do little jobs for me, I directed him to make 2 chair frames, no larger than those I had in my box, and then to bore little holes with a fine awl round the parts where I designed, the backs and seats. Through these holes I wove the strongest hairs I could pick out, just after the manner of cane chairs in England. When they were finished, I made a present of them to Her Majesty, who kept them in her cabinet, and used to show them for curiosities, as indeed they were the wonder of every one that beheld them. The Queen would have made me sit upon one of these chairs, but I absolutely refused to obey her, protesting I would rather die 1,000 deaths than place a dishonorable part of my body on those precious hairs that once adorned Her Majesty's head. Of these hairs, as I had always a mechanical genius, I likewise made a neat little purse above 5 feet long, with Her Majesty's name deciphered in gold letters, which I gave to Glumdalclitch by the Queen's consent. To say the truth, it was more for show than use, being not of strength to bear the weight of any of the larger coins, and therefore she kept nothing in it but some little toys that girls are fond of. The king, who delighted in music, had frequent concerts at court, to which I was sometimes carried, and set in my box on a table to hear them. But the noise was so great that I could hardly distinguish the tunes. I am confident that all the drums and trumpets of a royal army, beating and sounding together, just at your ears, could not equal it. My practice was to have my box removed from the places where the performers sat, as far as I could, then to shut the doors and windows of it, and draw the window curtains, after which I found their music not disagreeable. I learned in my youth to play a little upon the spinet. Glumdalclitch kept one in her chamber, and a master attended twice a week to teach her. I call it a spinet because it was somewhat resembled the instrument, and was played upon the same manner. A fancy came into my head that I would entertain the king and queen with an English tune upon this instrument, but this appeared extremely difficult, for the spinet was nearly 60 feet long, each key being almost a foot wide, so that with my arms extended I could not reach to above 5 keys, and to press down required a good smart stroke with my fist, which would be too great a labor, and to no purpose. The method I contrived was this. I prepared 2 round sticks about the bigness of common cudgels. They were thicker at one end than the other, and I covered the thicker ends with a piece of mouse's skin, that by rapping on them I might neither damage the tops of the keys nor interrupt the sound. Before the spinet a bench was placed, about 4 foot below the keys, and I was put upon that bench. I ran sidling upon it, that way and this, as fast as I could, banging the proper keys with my 2 sticks, and made a shift to play a jig, to the great satisfaction of both their majesties, but it was the most violent exercise I ever underwent, and yet I could not strike above 16 keys, nor, consequently, play the bass and treble together, as other artists do, which was a great disadvantage to my performance. The king, who, as I before observed, was a prince of excellent understanding, would frequently order that I should be brought in my box, and set upon the table in his closet. He would then command me to bring one of my chairs out of the box, and sit down within 3 yards distance upon the top of the cabinet, which brought me almost level with his face. In the manner I had several conversations with him. I one day took the freedom to tell His Majesty that the contempt he discovered towards Europe and the rest of the world did not seem answerable to those excellent qualities of the mind he was master of. That reason did not extend itself with the bulk of the body. On the contrary, we observed that in our country, that the tallest persons were usually the least provided with, that among other animals, bees and ants had the reputation of more industry, art, and sagacity than many of the larger kinds, and that, as inconsiderable as he took me to be, I hoped I might live to do His Majesty some signaled service. The king heard me with attention, and began to conceive a much better opinion of me than he had ever before. He desired I would give him an exact account of the government of England, as I possibly could, because, as fond as his princes commonly are of their own customs, for he so conjectured of any other monarchs by my former discourses, he should be glad to hear of anything that might deserve imitation. Imagine with thyself, courteous reader, how often I then wished for the tongue of the Demosthenes or Cicero, that might have enabled me to celebrate the praise of my own dear native country in a style equal to its merits and felicity. I began my discourse by informing his majesty that our dominions consisted of 2 islands, which composed 3 mighty kingdoms under one sovereign, besides our plantations in America. I dwelt long upon the fertility of our soil and the temperature of our climate. I then spoke at large upon the constitutions of an English parliament, partly made up of an illustrious body called the House of Peers, persons of the noblest blood, and of the most ancient and ample patrimonies. I described that extraordinary care always taken of their education in arts and arms, to qualify them for being councillors born into the king and kingdom, to have a share in the legislature, to be members of the highest court of judiciary, from whence there could be no appeal, and to be champions always ready for the defense of their prince and country, by their valor, conduct, and fidelity. That these were the ornament and bulwark of the kingdom, worthy followers of their most renowned ancestors, whose honor had been the reward of their virtue, from which their posterity were never once known to degenerate. To those were joined several holy persons as part of that assembly under the title bishops, whose particular business it is to take care of religion, and of those who instruct the people therein. These were searched and sought out through the whole nation by the prince and his wisest counselors. Among such of the priesthood as were most deservedly distinguished by the sanctity of their lives and the depth of their erudition, who were indeed the spiritual fathers of the clergy and the people. But the other part of the parliament consisted of an assembly called the House of Commons, who were all principal gentlemen, freely picked and called out by the people themselves, for their great abilities and love of their country to represent the wisdom of the whole nation, and those 2 bodies make up the most august assembly in Europe, to whom, in conjunction with the prince, the whole legislature is committed. I then descended to the courts of justice, over which the judges, those venerable sages and interpreters of the law, presided for determining the disputed rights and properties of men, as well as for the punishment of vice and protection of innocence. I mentioned the prudent management of our treasury, the valor and achievements of our forces by sea and land. I computed the number of our people by reckoning how many millions there might be of each religious sect or political party among us. I did not omit even our sports and pastimes, or any other particular which I thought might redound to the honor of my country, and I finished all with a brief historical account of affairs and events in England for about 100 years past. This conversation was not ended under 5 audiences, each of several hours, and the king heard the whole with great attention, frequently taking notes of what I spoke, as well as memorandums of several questions he intended to ask me. When I had put an end to these long discourses, his Majesty, in a 6th audience, consulting his notes, proposed many doubts, queries, and objections upon every article. He asked what methods were used to cultivate the minds and bodies of our young nobility, and in what kind of business they commonly spent their first teachable part of their lives. What course was taken to supply that assembly when any noble family became extinct? What qualifications were necessary in those who would be created new lords? Whether the humor of the prince, a sum of money to a court lady, or a prime minister, or a design of strengthening a party opposite to the public interest, ever happened to be motives in those advancements? What share of knowledge those lords had in the laws of their country, and how they came by it, as so to enable them to decide the properties of their fellow subjects in the last resort? Whether they were always so free from avarice, partialities, or want, that a bribe or some other sinister view could have no place among them? Whether those holy lands I spoke of were always promoted to that rank upon account of their knowledge and religious matters, and the sanctity of their lives had never been compliers with the times when they were common priests, or slavish prostitute chaplains to some nobleman, whose opinions they continue servilely to follow after they were admitted to that assembly. He then desired to know what arts were practiced in electing those whom I called commoners, whether a stranger with a strong purse might not influence the vulgar voters to choose him before their own landlord, were the most considerable gentlemen in the neighborhood. How it came to pass that the people were so violently bent upon getting into this assembly, which I allowed to be a great trouble and expense, often to the ruin of their families, without any salary or pension, because this appeared such an exalted strain of virtue and public spirit, that his Majesty seemed to doubt it might be possible, not always sincere, and he desired to know whether a zealous gentleman could have any views of refuting themselves for the charges and trouble they were at, by sacrificing the public good to the designs of a weak and vicious prince in conjunction with a corrupted ministry. He multiplied his questions and sifted me thoroughly upon every part of his head, proposing numberless inquiries and objections, which I think it not prudent or convenient to repeat. Upon which I said in relation to our courts of justice, His Majesty desired to be satisfied in several points, and this I was the better able to do, having been formerly almost ruined by a long suit in Chancery, which was decreed for me with costs. He asked what time was usually spent in determining between right and wrong, and what degree of expense. Whether advocates and orators had liberty to plead in causes manifestly known to be unjust, vexatious, or oppressive. Whether party in religion or politics were observed to be any weight in the scale of justice. Whether those pleading orators were persons educated in the general knowledge of equality, knowledge of equity, or only in provincial, national, and other local customs. Whether they or their judges had any part in penning those laws which they assumed the liberty of interpreting and glossing upon at their presence. Whether they had ever at different times pleaded for and against the same cause, and cited precedents to prove contrary opinions. Whether they were a rich or poor corporation. Whether they received any pecuniary reward for pleading or delivering their opinions, and particularly whether they were not ever admitted as members in the lower senate. He fell next upon the management of our treasury, and said he thought my memory had failed me, because I computed our taxes about 5 or 6 millions a year. And when I came to mention issues, he found they sometimes accounted to more than double. For the notes he had taken were very particular in this point, because he hoped, as he told me, that the knowledge of our conduct might be useful to him, and he could not be deceived in his calculations. But if what I told him were true, he was still at a loss how a kingdom could run out of its estate like a private person. He asked me who were our creditors, and where should we find money to pay them. He wondered to hear me talk of such a chargeable and extensive wars, and certainly we must be a quarrelsome people, or live among very bad neighbors, and that our generals must needs be richer than our kings. He asked what business we had of our own islands, unless upon the score or trade or treaty, or to defend the coasts within our fleet. Above all, he was amazed to hear me talk of a mercenary standing army in the midst of peace, and among a free people. He said if we were governed by our own consent in the persons of our representatives, he could not imagine of whom we were afraid of, or against whom we were to fight, and would hear my opinion whether a private man's house might not be better defended by himself, his children, and family, than by a dozen rascals picked up at a venture in the streets, for small wages, who might yet get 100 times more by cutting their throats. He laughed at my odd kind of arithmetic, he was pleased to call it, in reckoning the numbers of our people by a computation drawn from several sects among us in religion and politics. He said he knew no reason why those who entertain opinions prejudicial to the public should be obliged to change, or should be obliged to conceal them. And as it was tyranny in any government to require the first, so it was weakness not to enforce the second. For a man may be allowed to keep poisons in his closet, but not to vend them about for his cordials. He observed that among the diversions of our nobility and gentry I had mentioned gaming. He desired to know at what age this entertainment was usually taken up, and when it was laid down, how much of their time it employed, whether it ever went so high as to affect their fortunes, whether mean, vicious people, by their dexterity in that art, may not arrive at great riches, and sometimes keep our very nobles in dependence, as well as habituate them to vile companies, wholly take them from the improvement of their minds, and force them, by the losses they have received, to learn and practice the infamous dexterity upon others. He was perfectly astonished with the historical account I gave him of our affairs during the last century, protesting it was only a heap of conspiracies, rebellions, murders, massacres, revolutions, banishments, the very worst effects that avarice, faction, hypocrisy, perfidiousness, cruelty, rage, madness, hatred, envy, lust, malice, or ambition could produce. His Majesty, in another audience, was at the pains to recapitulate the sum of all I had spoken, compared to the questions he made with the answers I had given. Then, taking me into his hands and stroking me gently, delivered himself in those words, which I shall never forget, nor the manner he spoke them in. My little friend Gilding, you have made a most admirable panegyric upon your country. You have clearly proved that ignorance, idleness, and vice may be sometimes the only ingredients for qualifying a legislator, that laws are best explained, interpreted, and applied by those whose interest and abilities lie in preventing, confounding, and eluding them. I observe among you some lines of an institution, which in its original might have been tolerable, but these half erased, and the rest wholly blurred and blotted by corruptions. It doth not appear from all you have said how one virtue is rewarded towards procurement of one's station among you, much less that men are ennobled on account of their virtue, that priests are advanced for their piety of learning, soldiers for their conduct or valor, judges for their integrity, senators for the love of their country, or counselors for their wisdom. As for yourself, continued the king, who has spent the greatest part of your life in traveling, I am well disposed to hope you may hitherto have escaped many vices of your country. But by what I have gathered from your own relation, and the answers I have with many pains wringed and extorted from you, I cannot but conclude the bulk of your natives to be the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. Chapter 7. Nothing but an extreme love of truth could have hindered me from concealing this part of my story. It was vain to discover my resentments, which were always turned into ridicule, and I was forced to rest with patience while my noble and most beloved country was so injuriously treated. I am heartily sorry, as any of my readers can possibly be, that such an occasion was given, but this prince happened to be so curious and inquisitive upon every particular, that it could not consist either with gratitude or good manners to refuse giving him with satisfaction I was able. Yet this much I may be allowed to say in my own vindication, that I artfully eluded many of his questions, gave to every point a more favorable turn by many degrees than the strictness of truth would allow. For I have always borne that laudable partiality to my own country, which Dionysius Halicarnassensis with so much justice recommends to a historian. I would hide the frailties and deformities of my political mother, and place her virtues and beauties in the most advantageous light. This was my sincere endeavor in those many discourses I had with that mighty monarch, although it unfortunately failed of success. But great allowances should be given to a king who lives wholly secluded from the rest of the world, and must therefore be altogether unacquainted with the manners and customs that most prevail in other nations, and the want of which knowledge will ever produce many prejudices, and a certain narrowness of thinking, from which we, the politer countries of Europe, are wholly exempted. And it would be hard indeed, if so remote a prince's notions of virtue and vice were to be offered as a standard for all mankind. To confirm what I have now said, and further to show the miserable effects of a confined education, I shall here insert a passage which will hardly obtain belief, in hopes to integrate myself further into His Majesty's favor. I told him of an invention discovered between 300 and 400 years ago, to make a certain powder, to a heap of which the smallest spark of fire falling would kindle the whole thing in a moment, although it were as big as a mountain, and make it all fly up in the air together, with a noise and agitation greater than thunder. That a proper quantity of this powder rammed into a hollow tube of brass or iron, according to its bigness, would drive a ball of iron or lead with such violence and speed as nothing was able to sustain its force. That the largest balls thus discharged would not only destroy whole ranks of an army at once, but batter the strongest walls to the ground, sink down ships with 1,000 men in each to the bottom of the sea, and, when linked together by a chain, would cut through the masts and rigging, divide hundreds of bodies in the middle, and lay all waste before them. That we often put this powder into large hollow balls of iron, discharge them by an engine into some city we were besieging, which would rip up the pavements, tear the houses to pieces, burst and throw splinters on every side, dashing out the brains of all who came near. That I knew the ingredients very well, which were cheap and common. I understood the manner of compounding them, and could direct his workmen now to make those tubes of a size proportionable to all other things in His Majesty's kingdom, and the largest need not be above 100 foot long, 20 or 30 of which tubes, charged with the proper quantity of powder and balls, would batter down the walls of the strongest town in his dominions in a few hours, or destroy the whole metropolis, if ever it should be pretend to distribute his absolute commands. This I humbly offered to His Majesty, as a small tribute of acknowledgment in return of so many marks that I had received from his royal favor and protection. The king was struck with a horror at the description I had given him of those terrible engines, and the proposal I had made. He was amazed how so impotent and grovelling as an insect as I, those were his expressions, could entertain such inhuman ideas, and in so familiar a manner as to appear wholly unmoved at all the scenes of blood and desolation, which I had painted as the common effects of those destructive machines, whereof he said some evil geniuses, enemy to mankind, must have been the finest contriver. As for himself, he protested that altogether few things delighted him so much as new discoveries in art or in nature, yet he would rather lose half his kingdom than be privy to such a secret, which he commanded me, as I valued my life, never to mention any more. A strange effect of narrow principles and short views, that a prince possessed of every quality which procures veneration, love, esteem, of strong parts, great wisdom, and profound learning, endued with admirable talents for government, and almost adored by his subjects, should from a nice and necessary scruple, whereof in Europe we could have no conception, let slip an opportunity put into his hands that would have made him absolute master of the lives, the liberties, and the fortunes of his people. Neither do I say this with the least intention to detract from his many virtues of that excellent king, whose character I am sensible will on this account be very much lessened in the opinion of an English reader. But I take this defect among them who have risen from their ignorance. They have not hitherto reduced politics into a science, as the more acute wits of Europe have done. For I remember very well in a discourse one day with the king, when I happened to say there were several thousand books among us written upon the art of government. It gave him, directly contrary to my intention, a very mean opinion of our understandings. He professed both to abominate and despise all mystery, refinement, and intrigue, either in a prince or a minister. He cannot tell what I meant by secrets of state, where an enemy or some rival nation were not in this case. He confined the knowledge of governing within very narrow bounds, to common sense and reason, to justice and leniency, to the speedy determination of civil and criminal causes, with some other obvious topics, which are not worth considering. And he gave it for his opinion that whoever can make 2 ears of corn or 2 blades of grass to grow upon a spot of ground where only one grew before, would deserve better of mankind, and do more essential service to his country than the whole race of politicians put together. The learning of this people is very defective, consisting only in morality, history, poetry, and mathematics, wherein they must be all allowed to excel. But the last of these is wholly applied to what may be useful in life, to the improvement of agriculture, all the mechanical arts, so that among us it would be little esteemed. And as to ideas, entities, abstractions, and transcendentals, I could never drive the least conception into their heads. No law of that country must exceed in words the number of letters in their alphabet, which consists only in 22, but indeed few of them extend even to that length. They are expressed in the most plain and simple terms, wherein these people are not crucial enough to discover above one interpretation, and to write a comment upon any law is a capital crime. As to the distinction of civil causes or proceedings against criminals, their precedents are so few that they have little reason to boast of any extraordinary skill in either. They have had the art of printing, as well as the Chinese, time out of mind, but their liberties are not very large, for that of the kings which is reckoned the biggest doth not amount to above 1,000 volumes, placed in a gallery of 1,200 foot long, from whence I had liberty to borrow what books I pleased. The Queen's joiner had contrived in one of Glumdalclitch's rooms a kind of wooden machine, 25 foot high, formed like standing ladder. The steps were each 50 foot long. It was indeed a movable piece of stairs, the lowest end placed at 10-foot distance from the wall of the chamber. The book I had in mind to read was put up leaning against the wall. I first mounted to the upper step of the ladder, and turning my face towards the book, began at the top of the page according to the length of the lines, till I had gotten a little below the level of my eyes, and then descending gradually till I came to the bottom, after which I mounted again, and began the other page in the same manner, and so turned over the leaf, which I could easily do with both my hands, for it was as thick and stiff as a pasteboard, and the largest folios not above 18 or 20 foot long. Their style is clear, masculine, and smooth, but not florid, for they avoid nothing more than multiplying unnecessary words, or using various expressions. I have pursued many of their books, especially those in history and morality. Among the rest, I was much diverted with a little old treatise, which always lay in Glumdalclitch's bedchamber, and belonged to her governess, a grave elderly gentlewoman, who dealt in writings of morality and devotion. The book treats of the weakness of humankind, and is in little esteem, except among these women and the vulgar. However, I was curious to see what an author of that country could say upon such a subject. This writer went through all the usual topics of European moralists, showing how diminutive, contemptible, and helpless an animal was man in his own nature, how unable to defend himself from the inclemencies of the air or the fury of wild beasts, how much he was excelled by one creature in strength, by another in speed, by a third in foresight, by a fourth in industry. He added that nature was denigrated in these latter declining ages of the word, and could now produce only small abortive births in the comparison of those ancient times. He said it was very reasonable to think not only that the species of men were also originally much larger, but also that there must have been giants in former ages, which, as it is asserted by history and tradition, so it hath been confirmed by huge bones and skulls casually dug up in several parts of the kingdom, far exceeding the common dwindling race of man in our days. He argued that the very laws of nature absolutely required we should have been made in the beginning, of a size more large and robust, not so liable to destruction from every little accident of tile falling from a house, or a stone cast from the hand of a boy, or of being drowned in a little brook. From this way of reasoning, the author drew several more applications useful in the conduct of life, but needless here to repeat. For my own part, I could not avoid reflecting how universally this talent was spread, of drawing lectures in morality, or indeed rather, matter of discontent and repining from the quarrels we raise with nature. And I believe upon a strict inquiry, these quarrels might be shown as ill-grounded among us as they are among people. As to their military affairs, they boast that the king's army consists of 170,000 foot and 32,000 horse, if that may be called an army, which is made up of tradesmen in the several cities and farmers in the country, whose commanders are only the nobility and gentry, without pay or reward. They are indeed perfect enough in their exercises, and under very good discipline, wherein I saw no great merit, for how should it be otherwise, where every farmer is under the command of his own landlord, and every citizen under that of the principal man in his own city, chosen after the manner of Venice by ballot. I've often seen the militia of Lorbalgrud run out to exercise in a great field near the city of 20 miles square. They were in all not above 25,000 foot and 6,000 horse, but it was impossible for me to compute their number, considering the space of ground they took up. A cavalier mounted on a large steed might be about 100 foot high. I have seen this whole body of a horse, upon a word of command, draw their swords at once and brandish them in the air. Imagination can figure nothing so grand, so surprising, and so astonishing. It looked as if 10,000 flashes of lightning were darting at the same time from every quarter of the sky. I was curious to know how this prince, to whose dominions there is no access from any other country, came to think of armies, or to teach his people the practice of military discipline. But I was soon informed, both by conversation and reading their histories, for in the course of many ages they have been troubled with the same disease to which the whole race of mankind is subject, the nobility often contending for power, the people for liberty, and the king for absolute domination, for absolute dominion, all which, however happily tempered by the laws of the kingdom, have been sometimes violated by each of the three parties, and have once or more occasioned civil wars, the last whereof was happily put an end to by this prince's grandfather, by a general composition, and the militia, then settled with common consent, hath been ever kept in the strictest duty. Chapter 8. I had always a strong impulse that I should some time recover my liberty, though it was impossible to conjecture by what means or from any project with the least hope of succeeding. The ship in which I sailed was the first ever known to be driven within sight of that coast, and the king had given strict orders that if at any time another appeared, it should be taken ashore, and with all its crew and passengers brought in a tumbril to Lorbrulgrud. He was strongly bent to get me a woman of my own size, by whom I might propagate the breed, but I think I should rather have died than undergone the disgrace of leaving posterity to be kept in cages like tame canary birds, and perhaps, in time, sold about the kingdom to persons of quality for curiosities. I was, indeed, treated with much kindness. I was the favorite of a great king and queen, and the delight of the whole court, but it was upon such a foot as ill became the dignity of humankind. I could never forget those domestic pledges I had left behind me. I wanted to be among people with whom I could converse upon even terms, and walk about the streets and fields without fear of being trod to death like a frog or young puppy. But my deliverance came sooner than I expected, and in a manner not very common, the whole story and circumstances of which I shall faithfully relate. I had now been 2 years in this country, and about the beginning of the third, Glumdalclitch and I attended the king and queen in a progress to the south coast of the kingdom. I was carried, as usual, in my travelling box, which, as I have already described, was a very convenient closet of 12 foot wide, and I had ordered a hammock to be fixed by silken ropes from the four corners of the top to break the jolts when a servant carried me before him on horseback, as I sometimes desired, and would often sleep in my hammock while we were upon the road. On the roof of my closet, just over the middle of the hammock, I ordered the joiner to cut a hole of a foot square, to give me air in hot weather as I slept, which hole I shot at pleasure, a board that drew backwards and forwards with a groove. When we came to our journey's end, the king thought proper to pass a few days at a palace he hath near Flanflasnick, a city with 18 English miles of the seaside. Glumdalclitch and I were much fatigued. I had gotten a small cold, but the poor girl was so ill as to be confined to her chamber. I longed to see the ocean, which must be the only scene of my escape, if it ever should happen. I pretended to be worse than I really was, and desired to take the fresh air of the sea, with a page whom I was very fond of, and who had sometimes been trusted with me. I shall never forget with what unwillingness Glumdalclitch consented, nor the strict charge he gave me the page to be careful of me, bursting at the same time into a flood of tears as if she had some foreboding of what was to happen. The boy took me out in my box about a half an hour's walk from the palace, towards the rocks on the seashore. I ordered him to set me down, and lifting up one of my sashes, cast many a wistful melancholy look towards the sea. I found myself not very well, and told the page that I had a mind to take a nap in my hammock, which I hoped would do me good. I got in, and the boy shut the window close, down to keep out the cold. I soon fell asleep, and all I can conjecture is, that while I slept, the page, thinking no danger could happen, went among the rocks to look for birds' eggs, having before observed him from my window searching about, and picking one up or two in the clefts. But that as it will, I found myself suddenly awakened with a violent pull upon the ring which fastened at the top of my box, for the conveniency of a carriage. I felt my box raised very high in the air, and then borne forward with prodigious speed. The first jolt had like to have shaken me out of my hammock, but afterwards the motion was easy enough. I called out several times as loud as I could raise my voice, but to all no purpose. I looked towards my windows and could see nothing but the clouds and sky. I heard a noise just over my head like the clapping of wings, and then begun to perceive the woeful condition I was in, that some eagle had got to the ring of my box in his beak, with an intent to let it fall on a rock, like a tortoise in a shell, and then pick out my body and devour it. For the sagacy and smell of this bird, enabled him to discover his quarry at a great distance, though better concealed than I could be within a 2-inch board. In a little time I observed the noise and flutter of wings to increase very fast, and my box was tossed up and down like a signpost in a windy day. I heard several pangs or buffets, as I thought, given to the eagle, for such I am certain it must have been that held the ring of my box in its beak, and then all of a sudden I felt myself falling perpendicularly down for above a minute, but with such an incredible swiftness that I almost lost my breath. My fall was stopped by a terrible squash that sounded louder in my ears than the cataract of Niagara, after which I was quite in the dark for another minute, and then my box began to rise so high that I could see light from the tops of my windows. I now perceived that I was fallen into the sea. My box, by the weight of my body, the goods that were in, and the broad plates of iron fixed for strength at the 4 corners of the top and bottom, floated about 5 foot deep in water. I did then, and do now, suppose that the eagle which flew away with my box was pursued by 2 or 3 others, and forced to let me drop while he was defending himself against the rest, who hoped to share in his prey. The plates of iron fastened at the bottom of the box, for those were the strongest, preserved the balance while it fell, and hindered it from being broken on the surface of the water. Every joint of it was well grooved, and the door did not move on hinges, but up and down like a sash, which kept my closet so tight that very little water came in. I got with much difficulty out of my hammock, having first ventured to draw back the slipboard on the roof already mentioned, contrived on purpose to let in air, for want of which I found myself almost stifled. How often did I then wish myself with my dear Glumdalclitch, from whom one single hour had so far divided me. And I must say with truth that in the midst of my own misfortunes I could not forbear lamenting my poor nurse, the grief she would suffer for my loss, the displeasure of the Queen, and the ruin of her fortune. Perhaps many travelers have not been under greater difficulties and distress than I was at this juncture, expecting every moment to see my box dashed in pieces, or at least overset by the first violent blast, or a rising wave. A breach in one single pane of glass would have meant immediate death, nor could anything have preserved the windows but the strong lattice wires placed on the outside against accidents in traveling. I saw the water ooze in several crannies, although the leaks were not considerable, and I endeavored to stop them as well as I could. I was not able to lift up the roof of my closet, which otherwise I certainly could have done, and sat on top of it, where I might at least preserve myself some hours longer than by being shut up, as I may call it, in the hold. Or, if I escaped these dangers for a day or 2, what could I expect but a miserable death of cold and hunger? I was 4 hours under these circumstances, expecting and indeed wishing every moment to be my last. I have already told the reader that there were 2 strong staples fixed upon that side of the box, which had no window, into which the servant who used to carry me on horseback would put a leathern belt, and buckle it about his waist. Being in this disconsolate state, I heard, or at least thought I heard, some kind of grating noise on that side of my box, where the staples were fixed, and soon after I began to fancy that the box was pulled or towed along in the sea, for I now and then felt a sort of tugging, which made the waves rise into the tops of my windows, leaving me almost in the dark. This gave me some faint hopes of relief, although I was not able to imagine how it could be brought about. I ventured to unscrew one of my chairs, which were always fastened to the floor, and having made a hard shift to screw it down again directly under the slipping board that I had lately opened, I mounted on the chair, and putting my mouth as near as I could to the hole, I called for help in a loud voice, and in all the languages I understood. I then fastened my handkerchief to a stick I usually carried, thrusting it up in the hole and waving it several times in the air, that if any boat or ship were near, the seamen might conjecture some unhappy mortal to be shut up in that box. I found no effect from all I could do, but plainly perceived my closet to be moving along, and in the space of an hour, or better, that side of the box where the staples were, and had no window, struck against something that was hard. I apprehended it to be a rock, and found myself tossed more than ever. I plainly heard a noise upon the cover of my closet, like that of a cable, and the grating of it as it passed through the ring, then found myself hoisted up by degrees at least 3 foot higher than I was before, whereupon I again thrust up my stick and handkerchief, calling for help till I was almost hoarse, in return to which I heard a great shout repeated 3 times, giving me such transports of joy as are not to be conceived by those who feel them. I now heard a trampling over my head, and somebody calling through the hole in a loud voice in the English tongue. If there be anybody below, let them speak. I answered, I was an Englishman, drawn by ill fortune into the greatest calamity that ever any creature underwent, and begged by all that is moving to be delivered out of the dungeon I was in. The voice replied I was safe, for my box was fastened to their ship, and the carpenter should immediately come and saw a hole in the cover, large enough to pull me out. I answered that was needless, and would take up too much time, for there was no more to be done, but let one of the crew put his finger into the ring, and take the box out of the sea into the ship, and so the captain's cabin. Some of them, upon hearing me talk so wildly, thought I was mad. Others laughed, for indeed it never came into my head that I was now among people of my own stature and strength. The carpenter came, and in a few minutes sought a passage about 4 foot square, then let down a small ladder upon which I mounted, and from thence was taken into the ship in a very weak condition. The sailors were all in amazement, and asked me 1,000 questions, which I had no inclination to answer. I was equally confounded at the sight of so many pygmies, for such I took them to be, after having so long accustomed my eyes to the monstrous objects I had left. But the captain, Mr. Thomas Wilcox, an honest, worthy Shropshire man, observing I was ready to faint, took me into his cabin, gave me a cordial to comfort me, and made me turn in among his own bed, advising me to take a little rest, of which I had great need. Before I went to sleep, I gave him to understand that I had some valuable furniture in my box, too good to be lost: a fine hammock, a handsome field bed, 2 chairs, a table, and a cabinet, that my closet was hung on all sides, or rather quilted with silk and cotton, that if he would let one of the crew bring my closet into his cabin, I would open it there before him, and show him my goods. The captain, hearing me utter these absurdities, concluded I was raving. However, I suppose to pacify me, he promised to give order as I desired, and going upon deck sent some of his men down into my closet, from whence, as I afterwards found, they drew up all my goods and stripped off the quilting. But the chairs, cabinet, and bedstead, being screwed into the floor, were much damaged by the ignorance of the seamen, who tore them up by force. Then they knocked off some of the boards for the use of the ship, and when they had got all they had mind for, let the hull drop into the sea, which by reason of many breaches made in the bottom and sides, sunk to rights. As indeed I was glad not to have been a spectator of the havoc they made, because I am confident it would have sensibly touched me by bringing former passages into my mind, which I had rather forget. I slept some hours, but perpetually disturbed with dreams of the place I had left, and the dangers I had escaped. However, upon waking, I found myself much recovered. It was now about 8 o'clock at night, and the captain ordered supper immediately, thinking I had already fasted too long. He entertained me with great kindness, observing me not to look wildly or talk inconsistently, and when we were left alone, desired I would give him a relation of my travels, and by what accident I came to be set adrift in that monstrous wooden chest. He said that about 12 o'clock at noon, as he was looking through his glass, he spied it at a distance, and thought it was a sail, which he had a mind to make, being not much out of his course, in hopes of buying some biscuit, his own beginning to fall short. That upon coming nearer, and finding his error, he sent out his longboat to discover what I was, that his men came back in a fright, swearing they had seen a swimming house, that he laughed at their folly, and went himself in the boat, ordering his men to take a strong cable along with them. Then the weather being calm, he rowed round me several times, observing my windows, and the wire lattices that defended them, that he discovered 2 stables upon one side, which was all of boards, without any passage for light. He then commanded his men to row up to that side, and fastening a cable to one of the staples, ordered them to tow my chest, as he called it, towards the ship. Where it was there, he gave directions to fasten another cable to the ring fixed in the cover, and to raise up my chest with pulleys, which all the sailors were not able to do above 2 or 3 foot. He said they saw my stick and handkerchief thrust out of the pole, and concluded that some unhappy men must be shut up in the cavity. I asked whether he or his crew had seen any prodigious birds in this air, about the time he first discovered me, to which he answered that discoursing this matter with the sailors while I was asleep, one of them said he observed 3 eagles flying northwards, but remarked nothing of their being larger than the usual size, which I suppose must be imputed to the great height they were at, and he could not guess the reason of my question. I then asked the captain how far he reckoned we might be from land. He said, by the best computation he could make, we were at least 100 leagues. I assured him that he must be mistaken by almost half, for I had not left the country from whence I came about 2 hours before I dropped into the sea, whereupon he began again to think my brain was disturbed, of which he gave me a hint, and advised me to go to bed in a cabin that he provided. I assured him I was well refreshed with his good entertainment and company, and was as much in my senses as ever I was in my life. He then grew serious, and desired to ask me freely whether I was not troubled in mind by the consciousness of some enormous crime, for which I was punished at the command of some prince by exposing me in a chest. As great criminals in other countries have been forced to sea in a leaky vessel without provisions, for although he should be sorry to have taken so ill a man into his ship, yet he would engage his word to set me safe on shore in the first port where we arrived. He added that his suspicions were much increased by some very absurd speeches I had delivered at first to the sailors, and afterwards to himself, in relation to my closet or chest, as well as by my odd looks and behavior while I was at supper. I begged his patience to hear me tell my story, which I faithfully did from the last time I left England to the moment he first discovered me. And as truth always forceth its way into rational minds, so this honest, worthy gentleman, who had some tincture of learning and very good sense, was immediately convinced of my candor and veracity. But further to confirm all I had said, I entreated him to give order that my cabinet should be brought, of which I had the key in my pocket, for he had already informed me of how the seamen disposed of my chest. I opened it in his presence, and showed him the small collection of rarities I made in the country from whence I had so strangely delivered. There was the comb I had contrived out of the stumps of the king's beard, and another of the same materials, but fixed into a paring of Her Majesty's thumbnail, which served for the back. There was a collection of needles and pins from a foot to half a yard long, 4 wasp stings, like joiner's tracks, some combings of the queen's hair, a gold ring, which one day she made me a present of in a most obliging manner, taking it from her little finger and throwing it over my head like a collar. I desired the captain would please to accept this ring in return for his civilities, which he absolutely refused. I showed him a corn I had cut off with my own hand from a maid of honor's toe. It was about the bigness of a Kentish pippin, and grown so hard that when I returned to England I got it hollowed into a cup, and set it in silver. Lastly, I desired him to see the breeches I had then on, which were made of a mouse's skin. I could force nothing on him but a footman's tooth, which I observed him to examine with great curiosity, and found he had a fancy for it. He received it with abundance of thanks, more than such a trifle could deserve. It was drawn by an unskilful surgeon in a mistake from one of Glumdalclitch's men, who was afflicted with the toothache, but it was sound as any in his head. I got it cleaned and put it into my cabinet. It was about 1 foot long and 4 inches in diameter. The captain was very well satisfied with this plain relation I had given him, and said he hoped when we returned to England I would oblige the word by putting it in paper and making it public. My answer was that I thought we were already overstocked with books of travels, that nothing could now pass which was not extraordinary, wherein I doubted some authors less consult the truth than their own vanity, or interest, or the diversion of ignorant readers, that my story could contain little besides common events, without those ornamental descriptions of strange planets, trees, birds, and other animals, or of the barbarous customs and idolatry of savage people, with which most writers abound. However, I thanked him for his good opinion, and promised to take the matter into my thoughts. He said he wondered at one thing very much, which was to hear me speak so loud, ask me whether the king or queen of the country were thick of hearing. I told him it was what I had been used to for above 2 years past, and that I admired as much as the voices of him and his men, who seemed to me to only whisper, and yet I could hear him well enough. But when I spoke in that country, it was like a man talking in the street to another, looking out from the top of a steeple, unless when I was placed on a table, or held in any person's hand. I told him I had likewise observed another thing, that when I first got into the ship, that the sailors stood all about me. I thought they were the most little, contemptible creatures I had ever beheld, for indeed, whilst in the prince's country, I could never endure to look in a glass after my eyes had been accustomed to such prodigious objects, because the comparison gave me so despicable conceit of myself. The captain said that while we were at supper, he observed me to look at everything with a sort of wonder, and that I often seemed hardly able to contain my laughter, which he knew not well how to take. but imputed it to some disorder in my brain. I answered it was very true, and I wondered how I could forbear when I saw his dishes of the same size of a silver threepence, a leg of pork hardly a mouthful, a cup not so big as a nutshell, and so I went on, describing the rest of his household stuff and provisions after the same manner. For although the Queen had ordered a little equipage of all things necessary for me while I was in her service, yet my ideas were wholly taken up with what I saw on every side of me, and I winked at my own littleness as people do at their own faults. The captain understood my raillery very well, and merrily replied with the old English proverb, that he doubted my eyes were bigger than my belly, for he did not observe my stomach so good, although I had feasted all day, and continuing in his mirth, protested he would have gladly given £100 to have seen my closet in the Eagle's Bill, and afterwards in its fall from so great a height into the sea, which would certainly have been a most astonishing object, worthy to have the description of it transmitted to future ages, and the comparison of Pathan was so obvious that he could not forbear applying it, although I did not much admire the conceit. The captain, having been at Tonquin, was in his return to England driven north-eastward to the latitude of 44 degrees and of longitude 143. By the meeting of a trade wind 2 days after I came on board him, we sailed southward a long time, and coasting New Holland kept our course west-southwest, and then south-southwest till we doubled the Cape of Good Hope. Our voyage was very prosperous, but I shall not trouble the reader with a journal of it. The captain called in at 1 or 2 ports, and sent in his longboat for provisions and fresh water, but I never went out of the ship till we came to the Downs, which was on the 3rd day of June, 1706, about 9 months after my escape. I offered to leave my goods in security for payment of my freight, but the captain protested he would not receive 1 farthing. We took kind leave of each other, and I made him promise he would come to see me at my house in Redriff. I hired a horse and guide for 5 shillings, which I borrowed of the captain. As I was on road, observing the littleness of the houses, the trees, the cattle, and the people, I began to think of myself in Lilliput. I was afraid of trampling on every traveller I met, and so often called aloud to have them stand out of the way, so that I had like to have gotten 1 or 2 broken heads for my impertinence. When I came to my own house, for which I was forced to inquire, one of the servants opening the door, I bent down to go in, like a goose under a grate, for fear of striking my head. My wife ran out to embrace me, but I stooped lower than her knees, thinking she could otherwise never be able to reach my mouth. My daughter kneeled to ask my blessing, but I could not see her till she arose, having been so long used to stand with my head and eyes erect to above 60 foot. And then, when I went to take her up with one hand by the waist, I looked down upon the servants and 1 or 2 friends who were in the house, as if they had been pygmies, and I a giant. I told my wife she had been too thrifty, for I found she had starved herself and her daughter to nothing. In short, I behaved myself so unaccountably that they were all of the captain's opinion when he first saw me, and concluded I had lost my wits. This I mention as an instance of great power of habit and prejudice. In a little time, I and my family and friends came to a right understanding, but my wife protested I should never again go to sea any more, although my evil destiny so ordered that she had not power to hinder me, as the reader may know hereafter. In the meantime, I here conclude the second part of my unfortunate voyages.